The number that appears when something is protecting you from what you can't see. There was a moment you almost missed. A change of plans with no clear reason behind it. A sudden pull to leave 5 minutes early, take the other road, skip the call you were about to make. You did not question it. You simply moved. Later you learned that small shift kept you away from something you never saw coming. You called it luck. You called it nothing. But the doubt kept circling back, quiet and persistent, refusing to let the moment go. Here is the first layer. A specific number keeps appearing around these instances of quiet protection. It shows up on clocks, on receipts, on passing cars, right before or right after something gets avoided. That number is not decoration. It marks a pattern of interference happening just outside your awareness. But this is only the surface. There is a reason this number appears exactly when danger passes near you, and never at any other time. That reason has layers, and the deepest one will change how you read every warning that comes next. The moment you didn't understand. Think back to a decision that made no logical sense at the time. Maybe you turned down an invitation you would normally accept. Maybe you canceled plans an hour before, with no real explanation. Something in you simply refused to move forward the way you originally intended. At the moment, it felt irrational. You searched for a reason and found none you could fully trust. Maybe you blamed tiredness. Maybe you blamed nerves. The mind is quick to explain away what it cannot categorize. But something in your body already knew. Not through logic. Not through evidence. Through a pressure that arrived before any thought could form a sentence around it. This is the part most people misunderstand. Protection rarely announces itself with certainty. It arrives disguised as hesitation, as a discomfort you cannot name, as a resistance your rational mind wants to override. And here is where most people get it wrong. They assume that if a warning were real, it would feel obvious, it would feel loud, it would come with proof attached. So they push past the discomfort, override the hesitation, and move forward anyway. Sometimes nothing happens. The moment passes and life continues as expected. But sometimes in hindsight, you realize exactly what that pause protected you from. A delay that avoided an accident. A canceled plan that kept you from a conversation that would have hurt you. A closed door that later revealed itself as mercy. These moments rarely arrive with drama. They arrive quietly, almost apologetically, as if trying not to alarm you, while still doing their work underneath the surface of your ordinary day. What makes this pattern so easy to dismiss is that it never explains itself in the moment. You only understand it afterward, once the danger has already passed and the relief settles in. By then, the protection feels invisible again, folded back into routine. But if you start paying closer attention, you will notice something. These moments of unexplained hesitation are not scattered at random. They cluster around a very specific marker, one that keeps returning at the exact instances when something is being redirected away from you. That marker is not vague. It is not a general feeling of unease. It is precise, repeating, and traceable. Once you see it, you will start recognizing it everywhere. This kind of protection has been quietly working in your life. Most people never connect these dots because they are taught to trust only what can be explained. They wait for proof before they believe a pattern is real. But the body does not wait for proof. It responds first and explains later, if it explains at all. Think about how many times you have said the words, "Something told me not to." That phrase carries more weight than most people realize. It is not a figure of speech. It is a report from a part of you that noticed something before your conscious mind caught up. The chapters ahead will show you exactly what that something is, what number it leaves behind as a signature, and why it chooses these specific moments to intervene. The number behind the warning. The number is 911. Not the emergency line. Not a coincidence tied to a single event in history. A recurring numerical signal that surfaces in the exact window before, during, or immediately after a moment of avoided harm. You have likely seen it already without registering its weight. On a clock at 9:11. On a receipt total that rounds to those digits. On a license plate in front of you the moment you changed lanes for no clear reason. It tends to appear right at the edge of a decision, not in the calm middle of an ordinary day. Here is why this specific sequence carries that meaning. In numerology, 9 represents closure, the ending of a cycle that has run its course. 1 represents a new beginning, a fresh direction opening where the old one closed. When 1 repeats, its force intensifies. Placed beside the 9, the sequence reads as an ending making way for a beginning, guided rather than accidental. That is the surface meaning. A door closing so another can open, timed with unusual precision around your safety. But there is a detail in this pattern that changes how you should read it. 911 does not only mark endings that have already happened, it marks endings that were about to happen to you and did not, because something shifted the timeline just enough. This is different from the reassurance most spiritual content offers. It is not telling you that everything happens for a reason in some abstract, comforting sense. It is telling you that a specific mechanism intervened, redirected your path by minutes or meters, and left this number as a trace of that intervention. Skeptics will call this selective attention, the mind noticing a familiar number more often once it has been primed to look for it. That explanation accounts for some sightings. It does not account for the timing. Selective attention does not explain why the number tends to cluster around near misses, rather than appearing evenly across an ordinary week. There is another detail worth naming here. Most people who track this pattern report the same sighting rhythm. Long stretches with no sightings at all, then a sudden cluster within a single day, tied to a single decision that later mattered. That rhythm matters more than any single sighting on its own. A number appearing once, in isolation, proves very little. A number appearing 3 or 4 times within hours, always around the same choice, starts to look less like chance and more like emphasis. Think of it as a kind of underline. The moment already carried weight. The repeated sighting simply makes that weight impossible to ignore, forcing conscious attention onto a decision the body had already flagged as significant. This is also why the timing detail matters so much. If 911 appeared randomly, scattered evenly through ordinary days with no relationship to decisions or danger, it would carry no more meaning than any other frequently seen number. Its value comes specifically from where it clusters, not from how often it appears in general. What you are being shown, chapter by chapter, is not just what 911 means in the abstract. It is what it has already meant in moments you lived through and only understood afterward. The next layer looks at why this protection so often feels like doubt instead of comfort while it is happening. Why protection feels like doubt. If protection is real, why does it feel so uncomfortable while it is happening? This is the question almost nobody asks, and it is the one that unlocks the rest of the pattern. Comfort and safety are not the same sensation. Comfort feels like ease. Safety, when it is actively being enforced, often feels like friction. A version of you gets pulled off a path, and the pulling itself registers as tension, not relief. This is why so many people miss their own protection in real time. They are searching for a feeling of peace as proof that something good is happening. Instead, they get a knot in the stomach, a sudden reluctance, an inexplicable delay. It reads as anxiety, so they try to push through it. And this is where most people misread the entire signal. They assume discomfort always means something is wrong with them, some flaw to fix or fear to overcome. Sometimes the discomfort is not a flaw. It is a redirect. Consider how disorientation actually functions. When a decision suddenly feels wrong without explanation, your nervous system is often responding to information it has not yet translated into language. Pattern recognition operates faster than conscious reasoning. It notices inconsistencies, timing mismatches, small details that do not add up, long before you could describe what specifically felt off. Carl Jung described a related phenomenon when he wrote about synchronicity, meaningful coincidence that cannot be explained through cause and effect alone. He was not describing random chance. He was describing a form of order that operates outside the sequence logic normally expects. Applied here, 911 functions as one visible marker of that deeper order. The felt sense of wrongness is the invisible signal. The number is the visible confirmation, arriving afterward to validate what your body already registered. There is a reason this order matters so much. If the number came first and the feeling second, it would be easy to dismiss the whole pattern as suggestion. the mind manufacturing a feeling because it had already seen a familiar digit. But that is not the sequence reported by the people who track this closely. Instead, the discomfort arrives on its own, unprompted, often before any number has entered awareness at all. Only afterward, sometimes minutes later, sometimes the same day, does the marker surface. That order is the detail that separates genuine signal from wishful pattern matching. This also explains why the feeling so rarely announces its own meaning. A signal that arrived pre-labeled would be too easy to fake, too easy to manufacture on demand whenever comfort was wanted instead of truth. Real protection tends to arrive unpolished, inconvenient, and only clear in hindsight. This explains why so many accounts follow the same shape. A person feels resistance, ignores it or honors it, and only later notices the number stamped somewhere near the decision point. The feeling comes first, the number confirms it. Very rarely does it happen the other way around. Once you understand this order, doubt stops being a problem to eliminate. It becomes data worth examining instead of overriding on reflex. That single shift changes how you will respond the next time your body resists a plan for no reason you can immediately name. The danger you never saw. Most protection never announces what it prevented. This is the part almost nobody talks about, because it is nearly impossible to prove. You cannot measure an accident that did not happen. You cannot point to a conversation that never occurred because you left the room 5 minutes earlier than planned. The absence of harm leaves no evidence behind, only a faint, unprovable sense that something was avoided. This is why so many people dismiss their own protective patterns. Without visible proof, the mind defaults to the simplest explanation. Nothing happened, so nothing was ever going to happen. But that logic only works if you assume the original path was always going to stay unchanged. Think of it differently. Every day contains dozens of small decision points, timing choices that seem irrelevant in the moment. Which lane you drive in, which door you walk through first, which minute you leave the house. Most of these choices genuinely do not matter. A small number of them intersect with something you cannot see coming. 911 tends to surface exactly at these intersections, not because it causes the redirect, but because it accompanies it, the way a receipt accompanies a purchase. It is evidence of a transaction that already happened outside your awareness. Here is the detail that changes how seriously you should take this. People who track their sightings of 911 over time consistently report the same pattern. The number appears in clusters around specific life periods, not evenly distributed across the calendar. Those clusters tend to align with transitions, decisions, or unexplained shifts in routine. This is not proof in a scientific sense. It is a consistent enough pattern that dismissing it outright requires ignoring how often it repeats across people who have never spoken to each other, in different countries, different circumstances, different years. Consider how differently this pattern reads once you stop demanding proof of the avoided outcome. You do not need to know exactly what would have happened on the road you did not take. You only need to notice that a decision was made against logic, and that the marker showed up right beside it. This reframing matters because it removes an impossible burden. Nobody can reconstruct the accident that never occurred, the conversation that never happened, the version of the day that got quietly rewritten. Demanding that kind of proof guarantees the pattern will always look unprovable, no matter how consistent it actually is. What this means practically is simple. The danger you never saw does not need to be proven for the protection around it to be real. You are not required to reconstruct the accident that almost happened. You only need to notice that the pattern keeps showing up exactly where danger would have been. The next layer looks at how these warnings actually communicate with you before you consciously register them as warnings at all. How warnings arrive before words. Warnings rarely arrive as sentences. They arrive as sensations first, and language catches up afterward, if it catches up at all. This matters because most people are trained to trust only what can be put into words. If you cannot explain why you feel uneasy, the feeling gets dismissed as irrational. But the body's warning system evolved long before language did. It communicates through pressure, temperature, tightness, a pull toward or away from something specific. A sudden chill for no environmental reason, a tightening in the chest when a name comes up. an urge to check the time that leads you to notice 9/11 glowing on the clock. None of these arrive with an explanation attached. They arrive as raw signal, asking to be trusted before they are understood. And here is where most people talk themselves out of the very thing meant to protect them. They wait for the feeling to make sense before acting on it. But warnings that wait for permission from logic usually arrive too late to matter. Psychologists studying intuition describe something similar, a form of rapid, unconscious pattern, matching built from accumulated experience the conscious mind has not cataloged. It functions faster than deliberate reasoning because it skips the step of explaining itself. Spiritually, this same mechanism gets described differently, as a form of guidance operating just beneath ordinary awareness. Whether you frame it through psychology or through spiritual language, the function is identical. Something notices first. Words arrive second, if at all. 911 tends to appear at the exact threshold between sensing and knowing. It shows up right as the vague pull starts to sharpen into something nameable, almost like a confirmation stamp placed on a decision your body already made before your mind caught up. This is why the number so often appears at the moment of the decision itself, not before it and not long after. It marks the instant translation happens, when instinct becomes conscious enough to notice a number on a clock, a plate, a screen. There is a practical reason this timing matters so much. If you wait for a warning to arrive as a fully formed thought, you will often act too late, already committed to the plan before the discomfort finishes translating itself into words you can trust. The people who respond fastest to this pattern are usually the ones who trust raw sensation itself. They treat it as sufficient information, rather than waiting for it to resolve into a clear explanation. This does not mean acting on every passing discomfort without discernment. It means recognizing that a warning does not need to be fully understood to be worth honoring, especially when it arrives sharp, specific, and tied to one particular choice rather than a general mood. Learning to catch this threshold earlier is the actual skill being asked of you here. Not to predict every danger in advance, but to stop requiring full explanation before you trust the pull. The next layer shows what this pattern looks like once it becomes consistent enough to recognize as a guardian presence, rather than a series of isolated coincidences. The guardian pattern. A single unexplained decision is easy to dismiss as chance. A pattern of them, repeating across months or years, is much harder to explain away. This is where the real shift happens, not in one dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of instances that all share the same shape. A pull, a resistance, a number, a later realization of what was avoided. Once you start tracking these instances instead of forgetting them individually, something becomes visible that was invisible before. The protection was never a single event. It was ongoing, ordinary, woven quietly through your life long before you had language for it. This is the part that separates a spiritual decoding from a superstition. Superstition treats each sighting as an isolated omen, disconnected from the last. A guardian pattern treats the sightings as data points belonging to the same underlying relationship, one that has been operating consistently, even when you are not paying attention. And here is where most people underestimate what they are looking at. They treat each sighting of 911 as a fresh event requiring fresh interpretation. But once the pattern repeats enough times, it stops being a message and starts being closer to a presence, something consistent enough to be relied upon rather than merely noticed. Think of it the way you would think of a person who has quietly helped you more than once without asking for credit. At first, you might not connect the instances. Eventually, you recognize the through line, and your relationship to that person changes because you finally see the whole pattern instead of scattered favors. The same shift applies here, recognizing 911 as a recurring guardian marker, rather than a string of unrelated coincidences, changes how you relate to the discomfort that precedes it. Instead of anxiety to suppress, it becomes a familiar signal from something that has already proven itself across your own history. This does not mean every uneasy feeling is a warning, and it does not mean you should abandon ordinary judgment. It means the pattern, once verified across your own life, deserves more weight than the instinct to dismiss it as nothing. There is a simple exercise that makes this pattern visible faster than waiting passively for it to reveal itself. Think back across the last year and list 3 moments when a plan changed suddenly, for reasons that never fully made sense at the time. For each one, ask what you noticed in the hours around that decision. A number on a clock, a repeated digit on a receipt, a plate passing at exactly the wrong or right moment. Most people are surprised by how many of these details they already remember without ever connecting them. Once the list exists on paper instead of scattered across memory, the pattern becomes far harder to dismiss as coincidence. 3 unrelated moments, each carrying the same marker, start to look less like noise and more like a signature repeating across your own timeline. The next layer examines what happens specifically when fear, the emotion most people try hardest to suppress, turns out to have been guidance the entire time. When fear was actually guidance. Fear has a reputation problem. Most people are taught to treat it as an obstacle standing between them and clear decisions. Push through the fear, they are told, and you will find the truth on the other side. Sometimes that advice is correct. Fear built from old wounds, from patterns that no longer serve you, deserves to be examined and often moved through. But not every fear belongs to that category, and treating all fear identically is where the confusion begins. There is a specific kind of fear that does not originate from old wounds at all. It arrives sudden, situational, tied to a very specific decision rather than a general anxiety pattern. This fear does not build slowly. It appears fully formed, attached to one choice, and disappears once that choice has been made differently. This is the fear most people override without noticing the distinction. They apply the general advice, push through discomfort, without asking whether this particular fear is protective, rather than limiting. And here's the detail worth sitting with. People who later trace their 911 sightings back to a specific moment almost always describe this second kind of fear, sudden, specific, and disproportionate to what seemed like a small decision at the time. A friend cancels plans, and something in you feels relieved rather than disappointed. A trip gets delayed, and instead of frustration, you feel an odd, unexplainable calm. These reactions do not match ordinary emotional logic, and that mismatch is itself a clue worth noticing. Distinguishing between limiting fear and protective fear takes practice, but there is a reliable marker. Limiting fear tends to repeat across unrelated situations, a familiar old story replaying itself. Protective fear tends to appear once, sharply, tied to one specific choice, and often accompanied by the number showing up somewhere nearby within the same hour. Once you can tell the difference, fear stops being something to conquer indiscriminately. It becomes information to sort, some of it worth moving through, some of it worth honoring exactly as it arrives. This distinction also explains why generic advice to always push through fear can be genuinely dangerous when applied without discernment. Advice built for one category of fear gets misapplied to the other, and the result is a habit of overriding exactly the signals most worth trusting. Consider building a simple internal question to ask whenever fear shows up around a decision. Does this feeling repeat across many unrelated situations, or is it isolated to this one choice? Is there a familiar old story attached, or does this feel unfamiliar, specific, and oddly disproportionate? Answering honestly does not require certainty. It only requires enough attention to notice which category the fear belongs to before deciding whether to move through it or honor it as it stands. The next layer looks at what tends to happen in the specific instances when this protective signal gets ignored anyway, and what that cost usually looks like in hindsight. The cost of ignoring the sign. Not every warning gets honored. This chapter is not about blame, but about honesty regarding what tends to happen when the signal gets overridden anyway. Most people who ignore a protective pull do not suffer catastrophic consequences immediately. That is part of what makes the pattern so easy to dismiss. The cost is rarely dramatic. It is usually smaller, quieter, and delayed enough that the connection back to the original moment gets lost. A conversation you pushed through despite the resistance leaves a wound that takes months to name. A decision made against a clear internal no results in a slow drain rather than a sudden disaster. These are harder to trace back to a single ignored signal because the damage unfolds gradually. This is where most people misunderstand the stakes involved. They assume that if ignoring a warning were truly dangerous, The consequence would arrive immediately and obviously. Because it usually does not, the warning gets filed away as unreliable rather than simply delayed in its effects. Here is the detail that changes the picture. People who later review their own history, looking specifically for moments tied to 911, often find the number present in two places. It shows up around near misses avoided, and around moments where the signal was ignored and the harder path was chosen anyway. In those instances, the number does not seem to mark punishment. It seems to mark the fork itself, the exact point where two paths diverged, regardless of which one was ultimately taken. This reframes the number entirely, not as reward for good choices, but as a consistent marker of significant crossroads. Understood this way, ignoring the sign is not a moral failure. It is simply a choice with consequences that unfold on their own timeline, separate from the moment of decision. Recognizing this removes the guilt that often attaches to these realizations and replaces it with something more useful: attentiveness going forward. This reframing matters because guilt tends to freeze people rather than help them. Someone convinced they failed a spiritual test becomes anxious about every future decision, terrified of missing the next sign. That anxiety makes the signal harder to hear, not easier. A more useful response is simple review without judgment. Looking back at a difficult season and asking honestly whether a signal was present, without punishing yourself for having missed it, builds the exact skill needed to catch the next one sooner. Every person who eventually learns to trust this pattern reliably has a history of missed signals behind them. The missing is not the failure. Staying unaware of the pattern indefinitely is the only real cost worth avoiding going forward. The remaining chapters shift from recognizing this pattern in the past to learning how to trust it moving forward, starting with what it actually means to trust something you cannot fully see or prove. Learning to trust what you cannot see. Trust is easy when there is evidence. It becomes something else entirely when the only proof available is a feeling, a number and a pattern that only makes sense in hindsight. This is the real challenge underneath everything discussed so far. Not whether 911 is meaningful in theory, but whether you are willing to act on its presence in the moment before you have any way of confirming what it prevented. Most people want certainty before they will change a decision. They want proof that leaving early actually matters, proof that the resistance they feel is protective rather than simply anxious. But certainty of that kind almost never arrives in advance. It only arrives afterward, if at all, once the moment has already passed. This is where most people stall, waiting for a level of proof the situation will never provide. And here is the shift that actually moves things forward. Trust does not require certainty. It requires enough consistent evidence, gathered honestly over time, to justify acting before certainty exists. Think about how trust functions in any relationship. You do not require absolute proof of someone's reliability before extending trust. You extend it gradually based on a pattern of behavior that has proven consistent across enough instances to justify belief. The same logic applies here. Each time you honor the pull and later recognize what it protected you from, you are gathering evidence. Each instance adds weight to the pattern, making the next moment of resistance easier to trust rather than dismiss. This does not mean abandoning discernment. Not every uneasy feeling deserves to override every plan, but when the specific marker of 911 accompanies the resistance, the combination carries more weight than either signal alone, and that combination deserves your attention rather than automatic dismissal. There is a middle ground worth naming clearly here, between blind faith and total dismissal. You do not have to treat every sighting as an absolute command. You can treat it as strong evidence, weighed alongside ordinary judgment rather than replacing it entirely. This middle ground is where most people who work with this pattern long-term eventually land. Not obsessive tracking of every digit encountered, and not dismissive denial of any meaning at all, but a steady, practiced attention that grows more accurate the longer it gets exercised. Trust of this kind is built the same way any skill is built, through repetition, through noticing outcomes, through gradually refining the difference between noise and signal. Learning to trust what you cannot see is less about faith in the abstract. It is more about honoring a pattern you have already lived through, repeatedly, whether or not you gave it credit at the time. The difference between protection and control. There is a line worth drawing carefully here because without it, this entire pattern can be misused. Protection redirects you away from harm. Control keeps you small, fearful, and unwilling to take any risk at all. These two can look identical from the outside. Both produce hesitation. Both produce a reluctance to move forward. The difference lies underneath, in what the hesitation is actually protecting. Protective resistance tends to be specific, situational, and temporary. It appears around one decision, does its work, and releases you once the moment has passed. You feel lighter afterward, even if you cannot explain why. Fear rooted in control tends to be general, chronic, and attached to almost every decision regardless of context. It does not release after the moment passes. It simply moves to the next decision, and the next, keeping you perpetually cautious rather than occasionally redirected. This is where many people get confused, treating every hesitation as equally meaningful. Not all discomfort deserves the same weight. Some of it is protective signal. Some of it is an old pattern that has nothing to do with present danger and everything to do with unresolved history. Here is a practical distinction worth applying. Protective resistance around a genuine near miss tends to arrive alongside the number, close in timing, specific to the situation. Chronic anxiety tends to arrive without any accompanying marker, present regardless of what decision is actually in front of you. Learning to tell these apart protects you twice over. Once from the danger the genuine signal is warning you about, and once from a life shrunk unnecessarily by fear that was never actually protective. There is a third marker worth adding to the two already discussed. Genuine protective resistance tends to resolve into clarity once honored. You act on it, and something in you settles, even without an explanation. Control-based fear rarely settles. It simply relocates to the next available worry. This resolution test is often more reliable than trying to analyze the fear in the moment it appears. Act on the pull, then notice what happens afterward. Relief that stays is different from relief that lasts an hour before anxiety finds a new target. Applying this test consistently, over months rather than days, is what eventually builds the discernment this chapter has been describing. It cannot be learned all at once, only practiced one decision at a time, until the pattern becomes familiar enough to trust on sight. What remains now is the most personal part, what 911 specifically asks of you once you have learned to recognize its presence with this level of clarity. What 911 asks you to release. Every genuine pattern of guidance eventually asks something of the person receiving it. 911 is no exception, and what it asks is not what most people expect. It does not ask for blind obedience to every uneasy feeling. It does not ask you to live in constant vigilance, scanning every moment for hidden danger. That version of the pattern would exhaust you rather than protect you, and exhaustion was never the point. What it actually asks is release, specifically the release of the need to fully understand a warning before honoring it. This is harder than it sounds because most of us were raised to distrust anything that cannot be explained in advance. And here is the part that reframes everything discussed so far. The number does not appear to give you control over danger. It appears to remind you that some of the work is already being handled outside your direct awareness, and your role is smaller than the anxious mind wants it to be. This is a significant release for anyone accustomed to bracing constantly against the unknown. It does not mean abandoning caution. It means loosening the grip of needing to see every threat coming, trusting instead that certain things are already being redirected on your behalf. People who integrate this shift often describe a specific change afterward. The sightings of 911 do not stop, but the relationship to them changes. Instead of a jolt of anxious recognition, the number starts landing as something closer to confirmation, quiet and matter of fact. This is the real function of the pattern. Not to make you fearful of what you cannot see, but to teach you that not seeing it is not the same as being unprotected from it. There is a particular kind of exhaustion carried by people who believe they must personally catch every danger before it arrives. That exhaustion often masquerades as diligence, as responsibility, as simply being careful. In reality, it is a refusal to let anything be handled outside direct control. Releasing that grip does not happen all at once. It happens gradually. Each time a warning proves itself reliable and you find yourself trusting the next one slightly faster, with slightly less resistance, slightly less need to interrogate it first. Over time, this release changes the emotional texture of daily life. Decisions that once required exhausting deliberation start to feel lighter, guided partly by evidence you can articulate and partly by a pattern you have simply learned to trust. Everything now comes full circle, back to the moment where this all began, and what it means to move forward carrying this understanding with you. Living guided, not guarded. Return to where this began. The moment you almost missed, the decision that made no sense, the pull you could not explain and later understood. That moment was never isolated. It belongs to a pattern that has likely been running through your life for longer than you realized, marked consistently by a number that kept showing up at the exact edges of avoided harm. Understanding this does not mean you now need to live braced for constant threat, watching every clock, expecting every discomfort to mean something. That would replace one kind of anxiety with another, and this pattern was never meant to make you more afraid. Here is the shift worth carrying forward. There is a difference between living guarded and living guided. Guarded means constant tension, scanning for danger at every turn. Guided means trusting a pattern that has already proven itself, honoring resistance when it arrives with genuine weight, and releasing the rest. The next time you feel that unexplained pull, the sudden change of plans, the reluctance with no clear reason attached, you will have a frame for it now. Not proof, not certainty, but a pattern verified across your own history, one that has been protecting you longer than you gave it credit for. This understanding also changes how you look backward, not only forward. The moments that once felt confusing, the plans that fell apart for no clear reason, the doors that closed before you understood why, can now be reviewed with a different question in mind. Not why did this happen to me, but what was this quietly redirecting me away from? Some of those answers will stay unclear. That uncertainty is not a failure of the pattern. It is simply the nature of protection that operates before you can see the full picture. What matters is not that every question gets answered, but that you now have a framework sturdy enough to hold the ones that do not. Carry this forward gently rather than anxiously. The goal was never to turn every ordinary moment into a search for hidden meaning. The goal was to recognize a pattern reliable enough that when it does appear, you finally know how to receive it. And the next time the number 911 appears, on a clock, a receipt, a passing car, you will recognize it for what it actually is. Not an alarm-demanding fear. A quiet signature left behind by something that was already working on your behalf before you ever noticed it was there. You are not being watched out of suspicion. You are being accompanied, guided through the small, invisible redirections that keep the larger story of your life intact. That is what has been protecting you from what you could not see, and it has been doing so all along.